So let's go ahead and hop over to chapter 6. Now, something that I find important in chapter 6 is that it breaks down the middle class. So, we think of the middle class as just one title, but it's actually two different groups. So, Elizabeth Warren has said that the poor used to be the only class that was struggling economically. Now we find that the division is between those who are prospering and those who are struggling, and much of the middle class is now actually listed on the struggling side. Many of those people who are struggling are professionals, college graduates, and sometimes people who have advanced degrees. You yourself, listening to this lecture, may be considered in the middle class. The middle class people have always persistently pursued social mobility and are seeking to defy the forces of social reproduction. So, how did the middle class even come about? Where did this come from? Well, in the 1800s, many middle class individuals were neither rich nor likely to become so, kind of, quote, middle of the road. Many owned farms and ran modest businesses such as handcrafters and tradesmen of small independent means. But during the first half of the 19th century, there was an explosive commercial growth that when we know about this. This changed the middle class businessman's behavior. So Europeans were seen during this time complaining that the Americans had drawn faces and frantic busyness and a preoccupation with the almighty dollar. They said that Americans were disinterested with leisure and were preoccupied with work. So you see that I note down there, does this sound familiar? Maybe this is the reason many of us now feel overworked. Or the articles about people not taking vacation times are becoming more and more frequently published. Because in this time, the middle class wanted to jump on that explosive commercial growth. But it's almost like we've never stopped working on that explosive commercial growth. We're constantly busy with what we need to do and the work that we need to get done. So during this era, middle class men found themselves released from their social standards of being rooted in the community. It was less about less about the community and less about families than it was about them. They were less involved with the family at home, and women became the more dominant figures within the domestic lifestyle. With this change, the importance of a middle class mother staying home had increased. So, mothers now were in charge of being the responsible one of developing their children, who now children were born into the world being seen as minds with blank slates, that the mother, in short, was supposed to provide the foundational writing on that slate, determining whether or not her children would be successful in life. So the mothers were supposed to supply guidance. They were supposed to prepare young boys for challenges of the industrial work world, and they were expected to teach their daughters how to run a household, and that their daughters would marry and have a family and be able to use the domestic skills and create the emotional connections with other women that they had learned from their mother. Now, often the daughters expressed regret about parting from their mothers at marriage and requested their presence when they gave birth. So they didn't necessarily want to lose that connection that they had with their mom. But that was the mother's job at that time, while the men were working and working and working very hard. So through the first 3/4 of the 20th century, the middle class was generally prosperous. However, it was, except during the Great Depression in the 1930s, most of us know about that there were decades following the economic crisis where the government introduced a number of social programs, including Social Security, unemployment insurance, the GI Bill, which provided college payments to returning war veterans. There were federal housing loans that were offered, and there was significant support to the middle class families. However, that raised issues of race in the middle class, When the government supports were given out, much more were available to whites than they were to blacks. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation, during their evaluation, were particularly concerned about African American neighborhoods and African Americans, invariably giving black neighborhoods the lowest ratings. This helped to establish the term called redlining, which is the discriminatory practice of refusing to provide mortgage loans or property insurance, or only providing them at accelerated rates for reasons not clearly associated with any conventional assessment of risk. And without those housing loans, blacks were often greatly disadvantaged in their efforts to move into middle class neighborhoods. So they didn't want to live, if they didn't want to live in the inner city and they wanted to move into a middle class neighborhood or a suburb, they weren't able to without these housing loans. So this brings a thought of Indianapolis. I know many of you are probably not from Indianapolis, but hopefully at least some point in your life you've driven through Indianapolis. Well, I was told the story of 38th Street. I don't know how many of you had been to 38th Street. 38th Street, the state fairgrounds, is actually off of 38th Street. And I was told a story by one of my professors that if you look to the left of 38th Street and the right of 38th Street, you'll notice a drastic difference. So on that right-hand side, so basically the northern part, if you're driving west, so the northern part of 38th Street is Meridian Street, and you have all of those different very nice houses. Actually, I think the governor's mansion is on there, and you see all of these very nice established houses. If you go south of 38th Street, that's where you start to see some of the more broken down houses, a lot older, maybe not well kept, and there's actually predominantly a lot more African Americans that live south of 38th Street. Well, this is the perfect example of why that split up occurs. Wherever the lines were drawn out between 38th Street and Meridian, African Americans were unable to move north of 38th Street because of not having these housing loans. The houses were much more expensive. They weren't able to pay for them without the loans, and so that kept them south of 38th Street. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly how that happened there at that corner, but if you've been there, if you drive by, you'll understand what I'm talking about if you need a perspective of, how did this occur, and then how did this geographically break up the races as well as the class individuals. So the text talks about, like I said, there's actually two middle classes. We have the upper middle class and then the middle class, which is sometimes referred to as the lower middle class. And with that, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other authoritative sources generally consider all white-collar positions middle class, involving professional or semi-professional, administrative, or sales functions. So then, they're broken down between white collar and blue collar. Now, white collar job holders are usually well educated or fairly well educated individuals who perform non-manual tasks in offices. Some are secretaries or clerks who receive salaries under the middle class minimum. Whereas blue collar job holders have obtained at least a high school diploma or less and do manual work, normally receiving an hourly wage. So most of us know the difference between hourly and salary. Many of the skilled trades, such as plumbers, welders, enjoy a solid middle class income. So it's possible that even if you have a blue collar job, you might get a salary. You're most likely to be hourly. Same thing with white collar. You might be hourly, but most likely your salary. So let's talk about some of the upper middle class woes that have occurred. If you're wondering where I'm at, I'm on page 154. So the declining economy has caused a lot of issues, especially for the young upper middle class individuals. Coming out of college, they're confronted with a work world with a substantial, sometimes 5-number student loan debt. Most of us know about this, where you go to school expecting that you're going to get the job of your dreams afterwards and be able to pay off all of that student loan debt because you're very much forced to go to college. You have to go to college to get a better job. Well, then when you get a better job, if you can even get that better job, you have a huge student loan debt that you're basically paying off once you get that job. Then, with that, once you find a job, you're more likely at work to experience layoffs, salary freezes, longer hours, and limited employer loyalty. The financial constraint has increased for the young upper middle class more than it was a few decades ago. So there's a lot more problems once you get into that workforce after you've already packed on that huge student loan debt. People are finding it almost impossible to support the combined costs of children or even wanting to have children, a house, having medical coverage, and also to even establish a retirement savings. The young middle class are reverting to being emerging adults who move back in with parents and rent instead of trying to buy a home, lease a car instead of buying it. Many cannot actually visualize ever being able to retire. So, with those problems, let's hop over to page 165. And within that, we have the middle class who often have access to helpful family members and friends and community individuals and groups, as well as various professionals and experts who can help out the less affluent and the less prominent classes, and those people who can't connect or afford to connect to those different types of people. The middle class people have that access. And middle class people are joiners. They're open to information and influence from various members of their class. Sometimes middle class individuals band together for mutual benefit. This is especially true within the younger generations, where social networking sites are becoming big, which are internet organizations that are seeking to build online communities of people sharing interests and activities. So back in the day, there was MySpace, now there's Facebook, and then professionally, you have LinkedIn. Most of you have heard of these websites. So also on page 167, with these social networks, that helps to push the idea of the lean, mean, middle class work machine. So what qualities do middle class individuals entering this work setting need in order to be successful? Well, they need to have an education, they need to be hardworking, self-controlled, hitting the numbers, act as a team player, and obtaining a patron. Now, I talked about before where there were a lot of issues within the workforce for middle class individuals. Well, there's 3 definitions that I want to mention in regards to these issues. This includes downsizing, which is the deliberate reduction of permanent employees in an effort to provide an organization with more efficient operation and or cut costs. Downsizing occurs. Not only is the upper middle class having problems, but also corporations are needing to at times downsource. Also, a lot of corporations are outsourcing, as it says on page 170. Outsourcing is a company's subcontracting of services to other companies instead of continuing to provide those services themselves. And then sometimes if they don't outsource the work or they downsize the work, then they'll get temporary individuals to do temp jobs, which are jobs produced when a company contracts with an agency to supply it employees, which has become prevalent. This is happening a lot more often. So, as we've noticed for the middle class, in recent years, financial difficulties have increased, especially for middle class families, and many Americans are likely to think that people are in debt are heavy, irresponsible buyers of exorbitant and unnecessary items, which we found is not true. So I want to jump back to page 159, where it talks about the ecology of class. Now, the ecology of class, or I guess actually the bottom of 158, is the largely unrecognized or acknowledged impact that residential or occupational location has on the quality of life. Within the state of Indiana, we constantly talk about location or ecology of class. You know, everybody always talks about the people that live in Carmel, Fishers, Hamilton County versus people who live in Southport or Greenwood versus those who live in downtown Indianapolis. Because of higher income as well as political influence, the upper middle class individuals live and work in areas that often have higher quality schools, lower crime, and effective municipal services such as garbage pickup, road repair, library services, or health care. The ecology of class is readily apparent in the American public education system, where district property tax plays a major role in school funding, creating financial inequalities between poor and affluent school districts not found in most other post industrial nations which distribute school funding at a federal level. So I have 3 children, and something that I've talked about with them is the difference between the school that they go to compared to what I went to. Now, I won't tell you what school they go to, but it is a wealthier school than what I went to in northern Indiana. So I will reveal I went to North Miami High School. Some of you have probably never even heard of that before. It's located in Miami County. It's a small farming school. And so with a small community like that, they don't exactly get the benefits that major schools get just for the sheer fact of that they're paid for by the school district. Well, if it's a small farming community with not a lot of people who have a lot of money, then it's difficult to, get a lot of really great things in that school district. So recently, if any of you are familiar with Wabash County in Indiana, there's several schools actually in Wabash County. And one of those is actually in the town of Wabash. And then there are 2 other country schools called Northfield and Southwood. And the school board is wanting to combine Northfield and Southwood instead of combining with one of the country schools with the city schools. The 2 country schools are struggling. They're in a lot of debt. They're not making basically enough money to be able to pay for a lot of the things that they need to have established for a school system. So, this is a great example of the ecology of class and how that affects the American public education system. So there's a big difference between the school that I went to and the experience that I had compared to the experience that my children have where they're located. So this not only affects the high school systems, but also systems like the quality of a hospital service in the area that it's located. So I don't know how many of you have ever had issues with going to the hospital, but recently my grandmother had a stroke, and she was taken to Wabash County Hospital, then a hospital in Huntington, Indiana, and then transferred to a hospital in Fort Wayne. Each one of those hospitals is owned by one hospital corporation. However, because of the geographic location and where they are and the type of skill sets that they have, the tools that they have, she had to be transferred 3 different places until they could provide her the care that she needed. So it does make a difference. Also, if you are more familiar with the Indianapolis area, this happens a lot of times by word of mouth for the hospital network community hospitals. A lot of times people will go to either community north or south, and they'll say something different about community east or west or back and forth. So if that gives you a little bit more of an example of what I'm talking about. So to bounce back to page 156, so after talking about that, I want to talk about families and education, just real quick. And so children growing up in the upper middle class have the advantages and access to capital over the less elevated middle class peers. They have better financial resources to spend on education, housing, various other items. They have a higher quality human capital and also more effective social capital involving family and community connections, and better cultural capital because parents' education and middle class experience lead to more effective guidance. College graduation is a prerequisite of the upper middle class, and it's important to get those good paying jobs by having functional literacy. So, after talking about that, I'm going to move on also the middle class life. The middle class, as you can see, the pictures that I have here, some of them are fun little kind of, political cartoons where it talks about, middle class problems, real problems, but not real actual problems, just middle class ones. Or the middle class, sinking fast. And then I love the one on the right hand side where it talks about, move back home, kids today are so lazy and irresponsible. Your mother and I started out with nothing. But as you can see, they're saying, I have a 5-figure student loan debt. Trust me, I would have loved to start out with nothing compared to having to add that on as well. And then lastly, we have on the right hand side, welcome to the middle class, where you have enough money to pay your bills and taxes, just not enough money for anything else. And then you can see the Wall Street, missing middle class, American dream. And I love the one on the left hand side where a lot of families are dealing with this. The shirt off your back clothiers by appointment only. Golden Fleece Hair Salon. The Marie Antoinette Pastry Shop. Elite Apartments. Trespassers will be shot. If you have to ask, you can't afford it. Food store. So these are just kind of some fun political pictures that I found that I know are how a lot of people feel in regards to middle class at this current time. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. But other than that, that's the end of this lecture.